Hi guys, today we are going to take some notes on the very first civilizations that developed in the world. So we'll talk a little bit about each of these different places and what life was like there, and we're also going to talk about what makes something a civilization and how we got from the Neolithic Revolution to these places popping up everywhere. So we're going to focus on four major civilizations. There are four main ones that started everything off. So they were the first four to really develop. And these are what we would call early river valley civilizations. So if I say ERVCs, I'm talking about early river valley civilizations. So you can guess then what all four of these civilizations had in common, which is that they all popped up around river valleys. So they all centered around a river, and there was at least one river in each area that was very important to the way that people lived. And you'll start to see why this was such a big deal. Let's look at our questions for this set of notes. So these are the main things that I want you to think about as we're going through the notes and be able to answer these when we are finished. So number one, how did the Neolithic Revolution contribute to the rise of the ERVCs? Number two, how did cities contribute to the rise of things like math, science, government, art, etc.? And then last, how did ancient law codes affect the laws that we have today? So let's jump right into Egypt. And Egypt is probably the civilization out of these early civilizations you know the most about. So the river that Egypt centers on is called the Nile, and you've probably heard of this as well. And if you've heard of it, it's because it is the longest river in the world, and the best areas to live on the Nile are near the delta. Now, this is a little review from your geography skills. This is the delta on our map here, and that's where all the best soil is going to be at. And as we know, soil is important to grow food. If you're going to be farming, you want good soil. You don't want to be farming in the desert. So you want to have a source of water somewhere that's going to be giving that soil all the nutrients that it needs. And so in Egypt, that was along the Nile River, especially up here at the Delta. So the Nile River was very important. It was what brought Egyptians all together, that they all lived near the river and they all used the river for everything. To travel, they used it for food, for obviously watering their crops. They used it to drink water, all of these things. Another interesting thing about Egypt is its geography, in that it has a lot of natural barriers which protect it from outsiders. So it protects it from being invaded. So for instance, you have to the north, you have the Mediterranean Sea. To the south, you have desert land. To the west, you also have a huge desert, and to the east, you have a mountain range, and the mountains here are difficult to get through. So on all sides, you're pretty well protected, which is why Egypt is going to be a very successful civilization, because it's not as vulnerable to attack. So one thing that you may also know about Egypt is that they have a very rich religious background. They were what we call polytheistic, and this is one of your vocabulary words for this unit. And poly means many, and theism is referring to a god. So if they're polytheistic, then we know that means that they believe in many gods. So here are some of the gods that they found to be important. This is definitely not all, because they have a lot. So here are some of the big ones. Atum and Re were sun gods, and they were able to change their form. Sun gods were important, obviously, because you need sunlight for your plants and your crops to grow. Osiris and Isis were other gods that were also important because they were land gods. Again, this early civilization relied a lot on agriculture, so they really needed these gods that influenced their crop growth and the success of their farming, to be happy. When we look at Egyptian history, it's really broken up into different parts. If you talk to historians today, they break it up into different time periods. So there's one period called the Old Kingdom, This is during 2700 to 22 BCE. And remember, that's before Common Era, so it's counting down, not up. So there's like this random place in history where historians had sort of this time marker previously based on the of Jesus, because it was based on a Christian worldview. And so when they did all these numbers, they counted backwards to that date, and then once they got there, they counted forwards. So that might be a little confusing, but just know if we're talking BC or BCE, then we're going to count down, and that's going from oldest to most recent. And then if we talk AD or CE, which is current era, then we're going to count up like we normally do. So the pyramids are probably the most recognizable thing about ancient Egypt, and they were built during the Old Kingdom. So these were mostly tombs for the pharaohs. So the pharaohs were kept, when they died, they would be kept in a special pyramid, and sometimes their family would be buried in smaller pyramids around that large pyramid. One of the most well-known pyramids in Egypt is the pyramid at Giza, and this is the largest one in ancient Egypt, and it's still there today. You can go see it, and there's also this famous structure called the Sphinx, and the Sphinx looks like kind of like this creature that has a human head, but it has the body of a lion, and it guards the pyramid at Giza. Then we have the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom is sort of, well, it's in the middle of Egyptian history, and it's this time period where things were pretty crazy. And during that time, because life got so chaotic, the status of the pharaoh changed slightly, and they viewed the pharaoh as someone who was supposed to provide for their people. So the pharaoh is the monarch, the king that rules over all of Egypt. He was also considered by his people to be a god. So he was sort of this ruler that had a religious status and political status, and we would call that type of a government a theocracy. And that's another vocab word. So then we come to the New Kingdom, and during the New Kingdom, this is when Egypt really rises to becoming the most powerful state in northern Africa. And this is when the famous King Tut lived. He was well known, one, because he was the youngest pharaoh that we know of, and two, because he is the best representation we have as historians and archaeologists of mummification. Now, I know you guys all know what mummies are because, I mean, you can't go to the store during Halloween and not see some kind of mummy picture everywhere. And mummification is something that Egyptians practiced, and it was taken very seriously. Now, if you look at this picture over here, this is what we believe King Tut looked like when he was alive. And this is what he looks like now. Now, okay, I know you're probably freaking out. This is disgusting. But imagine, I mean, you're centuries old. You are hundreds and hundreds of years old. He's looking pretty good for his age, to be honest. So really, that is because of this process that the Egyptians went through to preserve his body. So I'll talk to you guys a little bit more about what that looks like. Another famous king in Egyptian history is Ramses II. Ramses is the guy who basically took back a lot of the territory that Egypt had lost in the Middle Kingdom period, but they lose it again not long after him to what we would call the Sea People, and these are the Phoenicians. And I'm going to put a pin in that name because we'll come back to the Phoenicians later, and you'll hear more about them. All right, so let's talk about mummification really fast. So this was a process that was used to basically dry out a body after death to keep it from rotting, because when a body rots, it's because of moisture in the body. So the first thing you need to know about this is that it's a religious ritual. So it was done in a workshop by the priests in Egypt. And the first thing they would do is they would take out major organs. So that was things like the lungs, the liver, the stomach, and the intestines. And then they would put them in these jars called canopic jars. And that's what these jars are over here. And you'll notice each jar has a different lid with a different head on it. And each of these major organs was placed in a specific one of these canopic jars. And they were kept in the tomb with the body. Now, this, I think, was for them to preserve the body better, but also they believed that the soul could return back to the body, and so they would need these organs again later, so that's why they don't just get rid of them. The brain also gets removed, but it's not kept in a jar. The brain gets removed through a pretty intense process of basically sticking something up through the nose, running it through the head and kind of making the brain jelly and pulling it back out. Yeah, yum. I hope you're not eating while you watch this. So then the body gets covered in this salt that absorbs all the rest of the moisture that's left in the body. And then they fill it up with spices to make it smell better and to keep it from rotting. And then they soak linen strips in a material called resin. That's it becomes sticky and it's going to dry and preserve things, and they wrap it up in that. And that's what you see all the time. That's what we as kids, we all wrap ourselves in toilet paper and say, I'm a mummy. So that's where that part comes from. And then after 70 days, after letting that process sort of go for 70 days, they take a mask that's supposed to look very lifelike, very similar to what the person looked like, maybe making them look as good as possible, right? So like maybe an idealized version. And they place that over the head and the shoulders, and that goes over the body. And then everything is sealed into the tomb. So that's the basics. There are great videos online that you can find that talk more about it and kind of there's a great one that has like an animation that I'll probably share with you guys. Okay, so when we talk about Egyptian society, so what was life like in Egypt and how did people relate to each other? The irony is that it really looked a lot like a pyramid in the sense that if you look here at this picture, you had more people in the lowest levels of the society with the least power and fewer up at the top. So at the top you obviously have Pharaoh, he's the god king, he's the leader. And then below him you have the people that serve him and work with him on a daily basis. You have the upper class nobles and the priests. Then you have your scribes. Those are the people who are in charge of recording things, writing and recording what's going on in every aspect of Egypt. And you have your soldiers, also important, right? Because they protect everybody. Below that, you have your craftspeople, all the people that make the goods, that are artisans, merchants that sell things, that make things. And then at the bottom, you have your farmers, your peasants, and the slaves. And yes, slavery existed all the way back in ancient history. It's been around a very long time. In Egypt, slavery was not necessarily based on differences in race, but more in class. So that's Egyptian society on the big picture scale. Now let's zoom in to families. So what's going on with family? How do men and women relate? How do parents and children relate, etc.? So one thing that you should remember from learning about the Neolithic Revolution is that men and women already started, before the first societies were even established, already started to have a little bit of inequality. Men were considered to be stronger and more important because they were the hunters, women were the gatherers. At first it was pretty close, and then as these societies are growing, that divide is getting bigger. So already in ancient Egypt, women are expected to stay at home with the kids and educate them. They're the ones basically homeschooling. And so they're in charge of children and education. But one thing that's special about Egypt, especially at this time in history, is that women in Egypt were allowed to own property. And it was typical in most other societies at this time for women to not only not have their own property, but if they did have anything that they owned before they got married, it would go to their husband. So once, say they had a piece of land and they got married, the husband would become the owner. Whereas in Egypt, ancient Egypt allowed women to keep that for themselves. It was still their property, their own private property. and it didn't go to their husband automatically. So that's a real big plus for women in Egyptian society and something that made them unique. Now, last thing that we'll talk about with Egypt, and of course, kind of coming back to this big idea that we have, which is that writing and history go together. So writing is an important part of any civilization, because with a civilization, you now have more and more people being born that you have to keep track of, more and more systems you have to create, like who's gonna, take care of trade and record all the business transactions, who's gonna make sure everybody is not building on each other's land or taking each other's property and all of these things. So there's a lot of stuff that happens in society, in civilization, that needs to be kept track of. And so writing makes that so much easier. Now, in Egyptian society, they used two main scripts, two types of writing. So the first one is called hieroglyphics. This is the one you've probably heard of or seen before because it's very fun. If you've ever seen the movie Prince of Egypt, which is a great animated movie that you should watch, there's a wonderful scene in the movie where the main character falls asleep, and when he's having this dream about something that happened to him in his childhood, it's all in hieroglyphics. So he is watching on the walls of a pyramid all of these things happening on the wall in this artwork, and it's like it's all being acted out in hieroglyphics. So it's really cool. Then you have hieratic script. Hieratic script is the more formal type of writing used. Well, and I shouldn't say formal, but the more businessy type of writing that's used for things like keeping records, economic things, trade, all of that. Hieroglyphics were mainly used for religious recording. So the Book of the Dead, a very famous and important piece of writing from ancient Egypt, is written mostly in hieroglyphics. In fact, maybe all in hieroglyphics. I'd have to check on that. But it's a religious text, and this was kept in most tombs in Egypt, and it was placed there as a form of protection. So it contained spells and magic formulas, and it was a very mystical piece of writing that was important to Egyptian religion, and especially in preparing for the afterlife. One thing that we also get related to writing from ancient Egypt is some of the first paper. So paper wasn't always used. We'll talk about some other societies or civilizations that when they kept writing, it was done on clay tablets and things like that. So not as convenient as paper. So the Egyptians used something called papyrus, which is a plant, and it would make something like paper. And in fact, writing was so important that it was seen as an important career to be someone who was what we call a scribe. Scribes are right in the middle because they're on the same level as soldiers, who are the protectors. But scribes were the ones that were keeping records and writing out religious texts and things like that. Many families would send their young boys off at the age of 10. They could go starting at the age of 10 to be trained in this. For the lower classes in Egypt, that was a smart idea because it was a great opportunity for many of the boys in ancient Egypt.